My name is Tristan Banwell, and together with my partner Aubin, we operate Spray Creek Ranch. We're located about 15 kilometers south of Lillooet, BC in the Upper Statliam Territory. We've been here since 2014. The farm has been operating here as a cattle ranch since the 1880s. When we moved here, we took on a cow-calf operation, and over the 10 years we've been here, we've slowly transitioned into a diversified, regenerative, organic farm, direct marketing meats to customers throughout the Sea to Sky region primarily. Now we have cattle, sheep, pigs, and we also raise poultry. We typically have meat chickens, turkeys, as well as laying hens. And we have a few horses we use for working the cattle, as well as a whole herd of guardian dog that we use to protect the livestock from predators. We started implementing rotational grazing on the farm at the end of the first summer that we were here. Prior to that, the way that cattle were grazed on the farm was in large fields, whole areas of 20 to 30 to even 50 acre pieces, and they'd be turned into that size of an area and left there until they had grazed it all down. And the cattle also spent the summers in the range. So we have a range tenure that's up in the mountains where the cows are able to go up in the summer. So in the past, the cows are moved up to the range in May, and they're grazed up in the range throughout the summer so that the ranch could make hay or produce whatever winter forage crops that we were going to be feeding them. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, into the late 90s, the production on the farm was primarily corn silage. So we have fields on the farm that grew corn silage for 27 years straight. After the late 90s, it went over to more alfalfa orchard grass hay pastures or hay fields. When we moved here, we started rotational grazing at the end of the first summer that we were here, and immediately saw the value of being able to control the cattle's impact on the forage and then move them off and allow the forages to recover. There are a lot of reasons to implement rotational grazing if you have ruminant animals. And in fact, it's the principles are similar, whether we're talking about ruminants or poultry or pigs. It's a good idea to keep the animals moving and control their impact that they're having on your land, on your soils, and on the plants that you're depending on. If we focused on ruminants, cattle, sheep, and other ruminants, there's a number of benefits to rotational grazing. One is keeping the animals moving for the animal health. For one thing, if you keep them in the same area too long, they have more opportunity to ingest and complete parasite life cycles. For the animal nutrition, if you imagine putting a group of animals into a big pasture, when they first get in there on the first day, they'll go around and preferentially graze all of the highest quality forages that are in there. They'll go around and take a bite off the top of every plant and just eat the best of everything. And if they're in that same paddock for, let's say, a week, you can imagine that over the course of that time, the quality of what they're eating is diminishing. They're eating all the best stuff first, and then they're slowly eating poorer and poorer quality forage until on day 7 or day 14, whenever they're finally ready to move from there, their nutritional plane has declined. And then you move them into the new pasture, boop, and they're back up to a high nutritional plane again. But if you're moving them daily or every 3 days or even multiple times a day, then they don't have a chance to go through this longer period of decline. Every single day, they have the good quality stuff, and then they eat everything that you need them to eat in that paddock, and then the next day they're back up to the quality nutrition again. It's a way to maintain more consistent weight gains. If you put your livestock into a large paddock and you let them, what we call continuous grazing, you just let them stay in there until they've grazed everything down. What happens is the first day they take a bite of all those plants, and then the next day or the day after, those plants are starting to try to regrow. But then before they're able to regrow and recover and redevelop their leaf area, which is their photosynthetic capability, then the animal comes and takes another bite out of it. And then the plant starts to try to recover again, and the animal comes and takes another bite out of it. And if you continue to do that in a continuous grazing situation, you weaken that plant, and you're forcing the plant to recover from its root reserves instead of using its photosynthetic capability to grow and to photosynthesize. So when you're rotationally grazing, the animal takes that first bite, and then your goal is to move them out of there before they take the second bite of that plant. You don't let them take a second bite and weaken that plant. You move them off of it, and you don't return to that paddock again until that plant has fully recovered to the point where you're happy with it. And you try to come back after the plant is fully recovered, but before the grasses have begun to go to seed, which is when the nutritional value of that plant declines. So maintaining healthy plants is a key reason for rotational grazing.
What we would consider our year-on grass in a short form version starts when there's enough growth in the grass in the spring to turn the cows out and start grazing. So we'll typically start grazing a little earlier than some of the recommendations you hear of waiting until it's 8 inches tall or something like that. We'll start earlier than that because we don't mind setting back some of the forage a little bit in its growth. Otherwise, all of it will be ahead of us and getting mature and seeding out before we know it. So we start off in the spring when there's just a few inches of green growth out there, and we'll tend to start on the area that has the most residual left over from the previous year. And that way, as the cows graze through that early spring growth, they're getting a bite of new spring growth from this year, but they're also getting a dried out bite of what was left from the previous year's stockpile. So that balances out their nutrition a little bit in the spring and reduces what we call the green fire hose effect of eating the really high protein spring feeds. Then as the forage quickly grows up throughout May and June, we're moving the cows pretty quickly still, but the paddock sizes start to get smaller to ensure that they're utilizing the amount that we want. And we're kind of clipping off, 2/3 of the growth of grasses in each paddock as we go. By the time we get through that first rotation, the first paddocks that we started in that are ready to go back to, that have now had, let's say maybe 5 or 6 weeks of recovery time, the grasses there might be getting mature by that point. And we're talking into July and going into August. You're gonna have some mature grasses. You're still gonna have lots of nice green growth, but you're going to have more seeded out, headed out grasses that are a little bit less palatable. We take that as an opportunity to make a deposit into the soil. So those rotations, we like to move more frequently, so usually twice a day, in tighter paddocks to ensure that everything that's not eaten is trampled down flat onto the ground to feed the soil. During that time as well, that's when the growth is all far enough ahead of us that we can take some cuttings of hay. So we'll choose some of the fields to avoid grazing a second time, and those will get cut for hay for winter feed instead of their second grazing. In mid to late August, we take the cows out to our range tenure, which is grazing lands that are up in the mountains on a lease. And they'll be up there from mid-August until early October. And during that period where there's no cattle on the farm, it gives an opportunity for all of the pastures on the farm to regrow as much as possible and ideally remain in that vegetative state as they go into fall dormancy. When the cows return from range, we start our winter stockpile grazing program, and they'll be grazing primarily dormant season grasses that aren't recovering then after that. When we run out of stockpiled forage or the snow gets too frozen and crusty and we can no longer graze through it, then we switch to feeding hay. And on hay, we're either putting hay out in rows and bale grazing it, moving them through that hay with electric fencing is our typical pattern of feeding hay. And by the time hay feeding season's over, spring grazing starts again. It does vary a little bit based on the weather, but when we moved here, the program was to start feeding hay in October and feed all the way through until April. And now we're typically starting to feed hay in mid to late January. We're able to stockpile graze until then. And I think that here in our climate, we're going to be able to stockpile graze all throughout the winter. And typically it's a balance of how much we are able to stockpile versus how much hay we've put up and stored and set those fields back instead of stockpiling that additional growth. So I think there'll always be little windows where it's too wet and muddy in the fields, or the snow is too crusty and frozen, where we'll need to feed a little bit of hay. But lately we've been able to start feeding hay in mid to late January, feed through February and part of March. And then in terms of when the spring grazing starts, it's highly variable here. And it could be anywhere within a month window from the last week of March to the last week of April, depending on the season and the weather.
Stockpile grazing doesn't just happen. You have to plan for it in advance, and planning for stockpile grazing starts during the growing season. So in order to try stockpile grazing, you have to go into the winter with something to graze. the growth is really high in the early summer, and then as summer starts to get hot, the growth starts to slow down. So during that high growth period, we're grazing or haying the fields in order to keep them in vegetative growth. And our goal with stockpiling is to go into the winter with as much stockpiled vegetative forage as possible. As much of the farm in tall grass that hasn't gone to seed yet as possible. That's different from the typical goal of going into the winter with as much hay as possible. So at some point you have to say, okay, I'm going to stop harvesting this field, I'm going to stop grazing this field, and just let it regrow and stockpile. And for what we're doing here, we've found that a pretty good time to start that stockpiling is anywhere from early to late August is the last time we want to be across the field before it starts to stockpile. It works out great for us because the way that we use our range is we actually put the cows up in the range in mid to late August, and that takes the grazing pressure off of the farm, and that's also typically when we'll finish up any cutting hay. If you start stockpiling too early, then the grass will grow large, but then it'll go to seed, and the quality of the forage will diminish once it goes to seed, and your stockpile won't be as high quality. The ideal is to go into winter with a tall vegetative sward of your grasses that haven't gone to seed yet, tall enough and that it'll hold up the snow and be visible to the cattle, and it'll still be really good high quality grass. There's a lot of reasons to do as much stockpile grazing as possible, but the biggest reason is cost. The highest cost in a typical cow-calf operation is winter feed cost. Every day that your cattle are grazing in a field that you didn't have to use a machine to harvest and you didn't have to use a machine to feed, you're saving quite a bit of money compared to a day when you're feeding hay. The more we stockpile graze instead of feeding, the more money we save. On most ranches, when you're winter feeding, you'll be winter feeding in a confined area, and then what you're doing is you're concentrating nutrients. You're taking nutrients off of your fields where you've harvested your feed or your hay or your silage, and you're concentrating those onto the fields where you're feeding. And in the extreme cases, like when we moved here, it was confinement feeding for months on end in the wintertime. Then that becomes a nutrient pollution problem essentially. And now you've got to get in there and either collect up that manure and spread it or somehow deal with it. Whereas when you're stockpile grazing, the cows are consuming that forage and then their manure is staying right there on the field where they're grazing. It's evenly spread throughout the whole farm, and it just maintains the fertility on those fields where you're grazing. So when we're stockpile grazing in the wintertime, we'll get a lot better yield out of the fields if we section it off, just like in the summertime, and give them a day's worth of feed in every paddock and move them every day or twice a day or once every 3 days. But if you put them into a whole big field, they'll trample down a lot more and they won't get the same level of utilization, especially if there's quite a bit of snow. So we use the same equipment as we do in the summertime. This is a 1/4 mile geared reel from Gallagher. And by geared, what I mean is that every time I rotate the handle 1 time, the reel will rotate 3 times. So it means that you can retrieve it at a walking pace without cranking your arm super fast. It works really well. And what you see on the end here is a type of hook that I can use to actually energize the poly wire from the handle. So if I hook this metallic hook on the end onto my hot fence on the exterior, it'll energize this poly wire, and this poly wire is a light plastic wire that has several conductive strands in it to carry the electric shock throughout the fence. When we're setting up in the winter time, we have to additionally get the posts into the frozen ground. So for that, I like to use a battery powered hammer drill with a masonry bit on it, and it's nice to have a nice long bit like this because then I can drill down into the ground without bending over to put in the posts. So first thing I'll do is hook the handle onto a hot wire on the fence, and that'll energize the reel. And I can set it up with the reel energized, but I've got the fence off right now. I'm able to turn it off with my remote. So let's walk down and we'll hook this up onto the other side. So now I'm at the other side and I want to leave my reel set up on this other polywire cross fence. So this fence runs all the way across the field to divide this field into 2 halves. so that each, what we call a cross fence that I'm setting up that makes a paddock, is about 450 feet long. Since I don't have any exterior fence here to hook this reel on, what we like to do is use one of these posts to make a brace. So I'll put this around the post on this fence, and I'll put it into the ground at about a little steeper than a 45-degree angle. And then that way, when this fence is pulling back on this fence, it's not going to pull this post out of the ground. Where you're going to use the masonry bit on the hammer drill and get a hole punched in there, pop that post into the ground. So I like to set out the line first and then set up my posts on the way back so that the fence is nice and straight. If you have a lot of curves and angles in your fence, then it just gives more places for the post to pull out. And if there's that slack in the line from there being a dog leg in the line, if it falls out of a post, then there's a lot of slack in the fence and the cattle can get through. So we'll just leave this hanging over the other post. What's important there is just that the conductive polywire isn't actually touching the fence post. Now sometimes if the snow's deep, it can be actually pretty tricky to find your hole, and in that case you should clear away some of the snow first so you can actually see where you've drilled. We'll just drop that through there, and even if the wire's touching the ground or anything, we have plenty of juice in this fence that it'll stay energized. So we've got a nice straight line, it's tight enough, and we're ready to set up the posts on the way back. So this is the part that they've just finished grazing, and you can see that if you dig through the snow's compacted from them walking over it, but while the snow was still loose, they've dug down and they've grazed off pretty much all the residual that was here. This field was cut for hay in late August, and it's been recovering since then. It's an alfalfa and orchard grass field. And if we look over here at this side, you can see, if we clear away a little bit of the snow here, you can see what our stockpile looks like. So there's quite a bit of grass. This is all what would have been third growth orchard grass with alfalfa mixed into it. And if we pull out some of this, let's have a look at it. So you can see that it's still nice and green. It's basically freeze dried, and the alfalfa even still has its leaves on it. And we do try to graze the alfalfa fields earlier in the winter, because if we get a lot of freeze and thaw where it's coming up above freezing quite a bit, the alfalfa loses its quality really quickly. It will shatter, the leaves will fall off, and it'll just be the stems left there. In this case, it got cold this winter and it's pretty much stayed cold. And we're filming this in early December, and this is still really good quality. The alfalfa has frozen, but it hasn't thawed out a bunch, and it's kept its quality. So that's really good. The orchard grass, on the other hand, we'll try to graze those alfalfa fields first because the alfalfa can lose its quality, but the orchard grass holds its quality really well throughout the winter, even if the conditions aren't very good. So, I mean, that's better quality right now. What they're grazing now is better quality than dry hay. So, looks great. And the other thing I wanted to look at here is this manure paddy. We'll get our videographer to get a close-up of some cow poop, but their manure looks great. You can see, we have a good consistency to the cow pats, and it's great doing the stockpile grazing because that manure gets distributed evenly across the field and not concentrated like it would if you were feeding in a confined area and then you've got to deal with that manure afterward. This manure can just stay right here on the field and be fertilizer for next year's growth. Where we are here in Lillooet, we don't get a lot of snow. It would be pretty unusual for us to get 12 to 18 inches of snow on the ground at one time, and it's usually really dry snow. So this is kind of the ideal situation for grazing through snow. The cows have no problem, as you can see, digging through this snow with their nose to find the forage. Other species like horses and sheep will actually paw away snow and dig down. Cattle don't do that. They tend to just move the snow away from an area with their nose and graze a little circle and then move over to the next area. And by the time that they've grazed this all down, they'll have compacted down the snow with their hooves and grazed through and picked up all of the grass that's standing up. There's other people who'd be better experts for talking about grazing through deeper snow, but I do know people graze through quite deep snow on the prairies, especially as long as the grass is up in the snow so that the cattle can find it. It's no problem. They know what they're doing. It does take them a little bit of time to learn how to graze through the snow. I remember when we very first started stockpile grazing, the first time it snowed and we got maybe 6 or 8 inches, I went out there, rolled up the fence and called the cows to move, and they all just looked at me like I was crazy. Like, no, this is when you start the tractor and bring us some hay. But I said, no, you got to dig and eat it. Sure enough, now they figured it out. They know the program, and we'll be grazing hopefully into early January this year. There are winter conditions that can shut down our winter grazing, and the main one is if the snow starts to thaw and then refreezes hard and we get a crust. You know, they're digging through with their soft nose. And so if you get a layer of ice on top of the snow, a little bit of crust is okay, soft crust, but if it gets a hard icy shell on top of the snow, that's gonna shut us down. So then we're going to transition over to bale grazing, or we're gonna try to find a place that on the farm that maybe is more sheltered or colder. There's a lot of different microclimates on our farm, so we take advantage of that. If the weather gets really windy and cold, we'll move them to an area with more trees for shelter. And like I mentioned, we'll try to graze those forage types that don't maintain their quality sooner in the season. So there's no way to predict if weather conditions are going to shut us down, but we can guess from how much forage we have available out there that we're going to be grazing until early January. The other thing that could shut us down is into the spring season, or if we have breakup in the middle of winter. If it starts to warm up, the ground thaws, then it's not worth it to have the cattle out there trampling through that mud and damaging the forage, the sod that you've got in there, because these are perennial sod pastures. So then we'll pull the cows out and put them in sort of a sacrifice area or a drier, gravelly area, or move them up and just start grazing somewhere that has higher ground that's not as muddy. Once we have to stop stockpile grazing, either because we ran out of forage or because the conditions aren't permitting it anymore, then we move over to a technique called bale grazing. Rather than hauling out bales of hay for the cows every day or every 2 days, firing up the tractor and feeding in ring feeders or rolling out bales, bale grazing is where we will set bales out in a grid pattern across a whole field all in one go. And then we'll use electric fencing to rotate the cows through those bales and feed them the amount of bales that they need for a day or 2 days, much in the same way as we do with rotational grazing. We'll start at a winter watering point, just like with stockpile grazing, and then we'll move away from there through a series of bales in a grid. So we can lay out 100, 200 tons of feed in one day. One nice thing about bale grazing is that you can pick a nice day to set out your bales. You don't have to go out in inclement weather. And of course, you have to go out to feed the cattle in bad weather still, but you've already done all the work. The tractor doesn't have to be started when it's minus 35. Right? You can pick a nice sunny day. You can move all your bales out in one go and then cut all the twine or net wrap off of the bales when it's nice out. It's nice to do it when the ground is frozen so you minimize the compaction from the tractor traffic on your field, but it's nice to pick a nice day to do it. We will pick a field for bale grazing that we feel like will benefit from a nutritional boost, because what we're doing is we're taking those nutrients and we're moving them onto that field through the residual hay that's left that you could term waste or you could term it fertilizer, and the cow's manure. You're going to give a big fertility boost to the field that you bale graze on, especially depending on how dense you go. And University of Saskatchewan has some great guidelines on bale placement densities to not put too much nutrients down on any one field. We like to bale graze on the same fields that we take the hay off of. So when you're cutting hay, you're removing nutrients from that field, and since we don't use fertilizers, being an organic farm, we like to put the fertility back on the field that it came from if we can. So we might not put out all the hay we need for the whole winter all at once, but we'll place all the bales on one whole field, so we'll typically have 1 to 2 months of feed out there in one go. The biggest benefit from the bale grazing for me, there's a lot of benefits to it, but the biggest benefit is not relying on your machinery throughout the winter. So if you're feeding every day or every 2 days and you have a tractor that breaks down, you need to have a second tractor waiting with the same implements to move the hay. It just feels risky, whereas here with the bale grazing, we can easily go away for a period of time in the winter and anybody can feed the cattle. They don't have to know how to start the tractor. They don't have to put that wear and tear on the machine, and you don't have the risk of the tractor not starting one day. They just have to go out and move an electric fence, and a teenager from down the road can do that. So that's a real big benefit. It saves money because moving the hay around is costly, and you have to be out there to do it every single day and start the tractor and drive out and get the bales and cut the twine. And anyone who's cut twine or net wrap off of frozen snow-covered bales knows that can be pretty miserable. So those are a couple of the main benefits from the producer's side, but also getting those nutrients back onto the field and putting the nutrients strategically where you want them on your farm, spreading that impact are really important benefits that are going to have soil health impacts the following year. Another consideration when you're doing your bale grazing set is that you have enough bale space for all the cows to access it. So you don't want to have a big herd of cattle all fighting over just 2 bales. And if you're finding that if you're using really big, heavy bales, and there's not enough bales for most of the herd to get access, then you might want to feed 2 days at a time so that all the cows have an equal chance to feed. Especially in a mixed age herd like ours, you don't want to have a situation where the yearlings can't get food because the cows are out competing them. One of the main differences in winter grazing is, of course, the water system. So here at our farm, we're very fortunate to have gravity-fed irrigation systems off of 2 of the mountain creeks that come from out behind the farm, all gravity fed. And so that means we have a water network all throughout the farm that we use in the summertime. And in the summer, as we're moving the cows, we're also moving their water and mineral with them every day. In the wintertime, all of this summer water system much of it's on the surface, and it's all shut off and winterized. So we have to start grazing at our very few winter water points and graze away from that winter water point. The reason we wouldn't want to do that in the summertime and we keep moving the water is because we don't want the cattle to graze the regrowth of the plants. As soon as they've taken that first bite of the plant, we want them to move on, and then we want to give that plant time to recover. Of course, in the wintertime right now, the plants they're grazing are dormant. So we don't have to worry about them going back and biting the plant as it regrows. So we can start at the winter water point and graze away from it without setting up back fences behind them because the plants are dormant for the winter. So for winter water points on the farm, we have a few places where we have access to natural water sources. We have a spring that comes down that actually comes out of the ground a little bit warm, 3 or 4 degrees. So that continues to flow throughout the winter, although sometimes we do have to break the ice. And there's a couple places where we've installed these winterproof waterers, which is really nice. So this is a Ritchie CT4. It has 4 holes, so you could water probably up to 200 head of cattle off of this, or we can split it on the fence line like we have here so that we can water 2 different herds on opposite sides. And what these have are balls that cover and insulate the watering holes. They keep the water inside a little bit insulated from the weather. And we have all of our winter waterers set up with an overflow that runs out to a pit drain. So we can keep the water running, just trickling in these waterers to keep the pipes from freezing. And the excess water overflows into a drain and just drains into a gravel pit over there. So that wouldn't work everywhere, but it works great here where we have really gravelly, sandy soils. But these winter water points, we do also have power, but they function great with no power down to -10, -15. When we get into the -20, -25, it's nice to have a heater inside the water and some heat trace cable along the pipes. Okay, so it's important to have these balls floating just a little bit below the lip. You need a little bit of a gap. If you set the water height a little too high, it'll push the ball up against the lip, and then that's a place where it'll freeze. It's important that the ball is free floating. So you want to check and make sure you have, at least 3/8 or ½ an inch of space in between the ball and the lip that holds it in place. And inside, here's the float. So when the water level drops down, it starts flowing. And if you look just in there, you'll see I've got an elbow plumbed through the wall, and that's my overflow. So the elbow height sets where the water will just be trickling all the time, and I set the float so that the water level is just a tiny bit above that elbow. That runs down into a drain that then goes away to that gravel pit I was talking about. And all the other plumbing, the 3/4 inch water line that feeds this comes up through a pipe from way deep down in the ground so it doesn't freeze. And then we have a GFI electrical outlet down here in this to run the water heater and the heat trace cable that's on the pipes. The other important thing with this is it has a water seal, meaning this little trough around here gets filled with liquid to keep it sealed against the weather. And it's real important that you fill that up with something that won't freeze in the wintertime. Otherwise, it's really hard to access these. The best things to fill that up with would probably be an RV antifreeze that's drinking water quality, not your toxic car antifreeze. Or I've heard people fill it with oil, but I think that would be pretty messy. So I use RV antifreeze in there. There is so much complexity in a diverse farm like ours when you're using agroecological systems for your farming, and you're not just trying to create a monoculture, wipe everything out, and just have one thing growing. You have the diversity, you have the ecosystem, and It's dynamic, it's complex, and there's so much to learn. And I just feel like sometimes I think about our farm, that our farm has been a work in progress since 1880. You know, we're never going to be at the end point. There's always more we can learn. We're always iterating and adapting, observing what's the outcomes of our management choices. And not only is every year a new chance to change things up and try things again, but every single day when you're rotational grazing is a chance to, did you give a little too much, not quite enough? And observing the animal impact on your systems, and then every year setting goals for how to improve it and make it easier for you to keep those animals moving and managing your impact on the land. It just keeps it interesting, and it means that it's a vocation that I'm certainly never going to get bored, that's for sure.